In this exercise, we're going to talk about hypervoxels and particle dynamics. And that's saying a mouthful, but it actually isn't all that complicated. Well, parts of it are, but it has some interesting applications, which you'll see in a minute. Now, here we are in layout, and we're not even going to be adding any objects at first. We're just going to talk about particles themselves. And particles are completely different than any object we work with. So if you look over here into items and you look way down here under add dynamic object, you'll see particle right here on the bottom. And if you create particle, it will create a particle emitter, which you can call anything you want. In this case, we're just going to leave it as emitter. And you can either create a hyperparticle emitter or a partigon emitter. I would recommend we start with this. And when you do that, you get this. Which is basically a cube or a sphere which has nothing in it. But as you pass the timeline onwards, as you drag the timeline onwards, you begin to see particles. Kind of looks like radiation. And what those are just basically random points that are generated. But they can be incredibly useful. So you also get this rather complicated dialog box. And this has everything that you need to use particles. Now, for example, right now, the birth rate of these particles is 100. Let's say that we increase that to like 500. You'll notice we get more particles. We also notice that eventually they disappear. And the particle limit right now is 1,000. So I'm going to set that all the way to the top at 10,000. So now you see more particles can be made, and they kind of sustain themselves, at least for a little while. And if you go to the next tab, you can see a few other things. And the lifespan is 60 frames, which means that the particles won't live any longer than 60 frames. I'm going to up that up to, say, 100. And if you do that, it creates the effect of more particles, and they hang around a little bit longer. And still, looking at this, it's hard to imagine how you're going to use this. But when we get to motion, we see we have velocity. I want to make those particles want to fly upward. And there they go, kind of like smoke signals. I'll give it even more. And I'll also have them explode out a little bit. And I'll even add some gravity, or some lack of gravity, to help them along. And so there we have a particle stream flying upwards. And so you might want to wonder, what are you going to do with that? So if I come down a little bit so you can see it. Now, first of all, this will sustain itself for quite a while. But the particles themselves don't really do anything yet. For example, if I were to go to virtual pervasive render, you will see nothing. That's because the particles are only ideas at this point. To give them substance, you have to go into the hypervoxel tab and work with that. So if you go into your FX tools, and you'll see towards the bottom here you got hypervoxels. If you click on that, you get this dialog box. And here's the funny part. You have to turn on the emitter. And you got to tap that box. And for some reason, you really got to tap it a few times to get it to hear you. I don't know why that is, but it's always been the case. So then you can give the hypervoxels some kind of substance. So let's see what substance they have now. If I go to VPR, they're still not there yet. Oh, yes, they are. Now we have kind of like a bubbly type thing. And you can change that to volume, and then it looks kind of like a smoky thing. And you can change it to sprite, which kind of has a ghost-like image. And so right away, hopefully you can see some benefit to this. This gives you the effect of smoke. and you can give it a texture. You can use a procedural texture of some type, and you can get those particles to have all kinds of different characteristics. And so right now, you still might be wondering what you can do with this. Well, the context for smoke can be endless. I'll show you a quick example. Let's say that you have a can. Let's say we've got our Coke can, and just for the heck of it, let's go ahead and put the surface back in. So that will be the UV surface, can, and we'll load the last image we used. And there it is. And we'll turn on smoothing, so we got that smooth can. And what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to make it smaller. So I'm going to size the can down a bit. That's probably pretty good. And then I'm going to move it so it's just to the bottom of that. So basically what we got now is fizz. So if I look at virtual progressive render, I see fizz coming out of the can. Like the can just opened up and shot this stuff upward. But I'm going to do even better than that. I'm going to go into my motion controls, go to Windows, Motion Options, and I am going to marry those two together. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here and I'm going to select the emitter instead of the can. And I'm going to parent the emitter to the can. And the reason I do that is that if I grab the can and I move it, see how that works? So you see, if you set the motion of the can, let's say we move the can over here and over here, and then as you see how that animation plays out, the can will have a stream behind it. So you could make a gas grenade or all kinds of crazy things, or a jet trail from an airplane. And if you see how that looks in virtual progressive render, you can get an idea what you can do with this. And this is a completely separate thing from everything else, but you can add this for all kinds of crazy effects. And I invite you to experiment with it. I'm not going to say it's easy, but it can be rewarding. And as you might remember from the previous example, you can see we've got a jet trail, and that was done using particles. And that's about as far as we're going to go into dynamics.